Yeah, thanks, Michelle, for the introduction, and of course, thank you for being here. It's great to see so many people enthusiastic about EA here in Berlin, and I hope you are having a fantastic time so far. So, I will talk about Srisks, or risks of astronomical future suffering. And reducing these risks is the main focus of the Foundational Research Institute, which is the EA research group I'm representing here. One ambition, arguably at the very heart of the EA community, is shaping the long-term future. Concretely, consider such cause areas such as biosecurity, AI safety, or AI strategy. One crucial part of the argument behind prioritizing these areas is that they are an opportunity to not only help the next few generations, but potentially the vastly larger number of sentient beings that might continue to exist in the coming billions of years or even longer. But of course, such concrete cause areas are only the tip of an iceberg, as it were. To arrive at such concrete cause areas based on the decision to focus on shaping the long-term future requires a lot of both empirical and conceptual work. So here are some questions we need to ask ourselves. How fast will certain key technologies such as AI advance? Or how do we compare the value of interventions targeted at influencing specific technologies with the value of broader interventions, such as promoting moral reflections? Or if we want to focus on improving the long-term future, what are the best heuristics to use when we think about what should we do in the near term? Should we, for example, as Nick Bostrom has argued, for now focus on maximizing the probability of an okay outcome, his maxi-POC principle? And of course, what's a good way, what are useful concepts to think about the various risks and opportunities we will face in the first place? Of course, there are also fundamental ethical questions that are relevant here. Most of them about the question, how do we aggregate the vast amounts of happiness and suffering we might potentially see in the long-term future? So this is about questions such as, how do we compare the value of changing the population size in the long-term future with improving the well-being of present people? Or at what level of optimism should we be willing to accept a bundle that includes both risks of bad outcomes and some chance of good outcomes? Or are there additional reasons for trying to help those we expect to be suffering the most? These ethical questions are certainly relevant for the implications of what I'm going to talk about, but this is not a talk about ethics. So I will sideline these questions a bit. And you might have heard that the Foundational Research Institute, which I work for, endorses a specific family of views regarding these questions, which we call suffering-focused ethics, but this talk will mostly be neutral about ethics. So while these questions may be relevant for the implications of what I talk about, the claims I make themselves won't hinge on any questions in normative ethics. So all in all, of course, the space of crucial considerations relevant for thinking about shaping the long-term future is much too big to cover it in any single talk. So I want to focus today on a specific angle, and this is the angle, how do we most usefully carve up the space of risks and opportunities we face or we might face in the long-term future. And the most popular typology to address this question is certainly Nick Bostrom's typology of risks, most notably including the concept of existential risks or X-risks. My goal today in this talk is to convince you that X-risks are actually a bundle of risks that are sometimes best treated separately. And in particular, that it's worth paying attention to the difference between risks of extinction on one hand and another class of risks that overlaps with X-risks. And these are, of course, the S-risks from the title of my talk. To understand the claims I just made, let's briefly recap the concept of X-risk. So Bostrom suggested to map different risks on a two-dimensional figure. Along the vertical axis, we ask how many individuals would be affected. Is it only one individual, everyone in some region, everyone alive on Earth, or even all future generations? And along the horizontal axis, we ask how badly would any single individual be affected if the risk was realized. And in this figure, X risks are those in the top right corner. So those risks above a certain threshold for both their scope and their severity. The original definition Bostrom used was an existential risk is one where an adverse outcome would either annihilate Earth-originating intelligent life or permanently and drastically curtail its potential. Now, one subclass of X risks are those risks that would affect all future human generations with respect to their scope and with respect to their severity, remove everything we consider valuable. That's what Bostrom called crushing. And one central example of such risks are, of course, risks of human extinction. But conceptually, there are more existential risks. And in particular, there are risks that are worse than risks of extinction in two respects. First, with respect to their scope, they wouldn't only threaten all future human generations, but all sentient lives that might ever exist throughout the whole cosmos. And with respect to their severity, they not only remove everything we consider valuable, but would also add a lot of disvalue. That is, things we want to avoid no matter what. Think of something like factory farming, but on a much larger scale. And these risks have been called by Brian Tomasik and others risks of astronomical future suffering, or as a shorthand, S-risks. And these are the risks that are the topic of this talk. Now, is this distinction I called attention to, does it have any action-relevant consequences? So, with respect to S-risks, what should we do about them? Is there any work we can do today to reduce them? Now, one point when thinking about this question is that it seems clear that all else being equal, reducing these S-risks is something that's desirable, right? All plausible ethical views think that suffering is something to be avoided, and so we have some reasons to avoid S-risks. So that's not the interesting question. The interesting question, of course, is, especially here at an EA conference, is reducing S-risk something we should actually prioritize, right? So if you're interested in effective altruism, you probably understand that there are a lot of good things you could do, but you are specifically interested in finding the most effective ones among them. You want to find the best priorities and the opportunities through which you could have the most impact. So the interesting question is, are there any reasons to prioritize work on reducing S-risk, and how would such work even look like? And I will address this question using the familiar framework of importance, tractability, and neglectedness. Let's start with the importance of reducing S-risk. So a risk is just a probability of some adverse event, and by definition, the adverse event when we talk about S-risk is pretty bad, astronomical amounts of suffering. But of course, it might still be true that it's not very important to worry about S-risks. Why might that be? Well, if their probability was sufficiently small, right? It might be that the probability of any such risks actually happening is so small that we shouldn't worry too much about them. So when assessing their importance, let's talk about how likely are these S-risks. And here an initial reaction you might have is, well, this all sounds a bit far-fetched or absurd. We can't even yet send humans to Mars, so why should we worry about suffering on cosmic scales? And this was certainly my immediate reaction when I first encountered these and related concepts. But as EAs, we should be cautious about taking such immediate System 1 reactions too seriously, because there's a large body of research in psychology and the heuristics and biases approach advanced by Kahneman and others that tells us that when making intuitive, immediate probability estimates, they are often driven by how easy it is for us to construct a prototypical example of the type of event in questions. And so when we are talking about something like Srisks, where there is no historical precedent for them, we can't easily recall any prototypical example and therefore might intuitively underestimate these risks. So instead of relying too much on these gut reactions, I suggest to break down the questions into two sub-questions. First, how likely is it that we attain the technological capabilities required for the potential of Srisks? And second, conditional on us having such advanced technology, how likely is it that this technology would actually be used to bring about suffering? With respect to the first question, I think we need to think about two technologies here that are often being discussed when thinking about the trajectory of the long-term future. The first of these technologies is artificial sentience. This simply refers to the idea that the capacity to suffer might not be limited to biological organisms such as animals, but that artificial systems we might construct in the future might also be able to suffer. And here the worry is that it might be much easier to copy or create these beings in large numbers, thus multiplying the stakes when influencing their well-being. Another technology is, of course, superintelligent AI, which could also unlock many more relevant technological capabilities, such as an ability to colonize other planets or space more generally. I won't say much more about this because it has received a great deal of attention so far already in the community. I'll just refer you to Nick Bostrom's excellent book about superintelligence. But even if you think maybe these technologies aren't possible, there would still be some means of, for instance, space colonization that would come with a potential of Srisks. So, for instance, some people in the EA community have argued that wild animals suffer quite a lot in their natural habitats, for instance, due to disease, predation, or starvation. And so if we introduced natural ecosystems on other planets without addressing this problem of wild animal suffering first, this might be another route through which we could multiply suffering above the levels we have seen on Earth so far. Of course, there's also, we should also think about, or we should also attribute some probability to the effects of some technologies we don't yet foresee, so unknown unknowns. And it might be hard to assess how likely it is that we will attain these technologies, and certainly we can't predict any specific point in time at which we should expect these technologies. But what I would argue is that with respect to technological capabilities, worries about Srisks don't require stronger views than worries about existential risk. Right? If we think that highly advanced technologies such as highly capable AI or space colonization are impossible, then maybe we wouldn't need to worry so much about Srisks. But conversely, we also wouldn't need to worry about wasting astronomical amounts of positive value, which is one of the main arguments behind a lot of the existential risk interventions the community is prioritizing. So let's talk about the second sub-question. You might still think, well, even if there is a sufficiently large probability that we will at some point attain these advanced technologies, how likely would it be that they would be used to bring about large-scale suffering? Here, an initial thought, I guess, might be, well, a lot of suffering, that's a pretty specific outcome, and so it seems unlikely that this would arise unless someone or something intentionally optimized for such an outcome. It wouldn't just arise by chance. So in other words, you might think, well, these Srisks, they are only plausible if there is some evil intent which actively tries to bring about a lot of suffering, and you might think, well, this seems pretty implausible. Why would someone with such bad intentions be able to control these future technologies? And I would agree with this. I agree that Srisks arising through evil intent seem relatively unlikely, but there are other sources of catastrophes involving large-scale suffering. So one, they could be completely unintended, for example, due to an accident, or because of indifference, or even due to a mindless process like evolution. Or third, they could be due to some strategic move in a conflict. Here the idea is that if you compete with an adversary about a finite pie of resources, this adversary can have instrumental incentives to harm or coerce you. And therefore, it might resort to moves such as threats or bribes to coerce you into certain behavior, and this might involve suffering, even though this adversary doesn't intrinsically want to bring about suffering. And completely blocking all of these unintended or strategically motivated consequences, catastrophes, I would argue, seems quite hard. It might require something like solving global coordination, preventing all sorts of conflicts and multipolar outcomes, and ensuring a sufficient level of moral progress and caution that no accidents or suffering through indifference, similar to the way we see it in factory farming, would arise. And to be highly confident that all these routes would be blocked, I would argue, seems relatively unlikely. This doesn't mean that I want to argue that it's more likely than not that future technology has bad effects. It seems quite reasonable to me to be optimistic here. The only point I want to make is I find it hard to believe that the probability that this drives down the probability of S-risks to the tiny amount that would be sufficient to stop worrying about them. Next, what about the tractability of S-risks? Is there anything we can do today to reduce these risks? And here my answer is yes, because to some extent we are already doing this. I think there is some overlap with familiar work in the X-risk area. More specifically, to the extent that AI trajectories going wrong, as for instance Nick Bostrom has discussed it using the term mind crime, to the extent that this is a source of S-risk, at least some of the current work in technical AI safety or in AI policy and strategy might effectively address not only risks of extinction but S-risks as well. That being said, if we open up these cause areas, any specific piece of work in them might be much more relevant to one type of risk or the other. So to give you a toy example, if there was some project in technical AI safety with the goal that even if AI control fails, uncontrolled AI would never leave Earth and would shut down after 100 years and just stop doing anything, then such a project wouldn't seem to help a lot with reducing the risk of extinction, but it would be quite effective with respect to preventing long-lasting S-risk. Now, that's not a very realistic example. For some more serious thoughts about differential progress within AI safety, I refer you to the Foundational Research Institute's technical report on suffering-focused AI safety, which you can find on our website. So, in sum, the good news is we are already doing some work that reduces S-risk. But note that this isn't true for all of the work in existential risk. For example, building disaster shelters or making it less likely that we will all be wiped out by some deadly pandemic or addressing tail risks of climate change, these all seem to be things that specifically reduce the risk of human extinction without helping much with S-risks, because at first glance they don't change the trajectory of the long-term future conditional on humanity surviving. There might also be broad interventions that are helpful for reducing S-risk. So I said that negative sum conflicts and strategic moves in them might be a potential source of S-risk, and we might think that strengthening international cooperation through various means is helpful for making these conflicts less likely. Or we might think it's important to further expand humanity's moral circle, for instance, to make sure that future generations will care about the suffering of wild animals or potential novel artificial beings. That being said, my sense is that for many interventions, we don't understand very well what their effect on reducing S-risk would be. So I think it might also be valuable to do more research about this and to specifically try to identify more effective strategies for reducing S-risks. And this is basically what we are doing at the Foundational Research Institute. There is another aspect of tractability I'd like to talk about, and this is the question, will we be able to raise sufficient support? You might think that reducing these risks is pretty hard, we would need a lot of resources, and maybe you worry that we can't get them, because talking about cosmic suffering is like pretty much outside the window of acceptable discourse in most circles. So you might think, well, these S-risks, they might be worrisome, but they are just too weird. We can't raise any support to reduce them. But here I think, I think that's a legitimate worry, but I don't think we should conclude that reducing these risks is futile, because not long ago, the situation with respect to AI safety in general was similar, right? Even 10 years ago, worries about AI risk were universally dismissed, ridiculed, or misrepresented as being about the Terminator or robot overlords or whatever. By contrast, today we have Bill Gates blurbing a book that talks about super intelligent AI and mind crime and other weird concepts. And some of the world's top machine learning labs, for instance, in Montreal, have started to do work on AI safety. So this seems to be a proof of concept that we can raise significant support for even weird cause areas if they are backed up by solid arguments. Last but not least, what about the neglectedness of S-risks? And as I said before, some existing work in the X-risk area already also reduces S-risk, so they aren't totally neglected, but it seems to me that they are getting relatively little attention. In fact, I've even seen people use the concepts of existential risk and extinction risk interchangeably, sort of like implicitly denying that S-risks are a thing at all. And as far as I'm aware of, the Foundational Research Institute is the only organization which specifically focuses on reducing S-risk with the hope that there might be low-hanging fruits in the space of interventions specifically aimed at reducing S-risk. Because this isn't the case for the current interventions. They have been picked and selected with their effects on the risk of human extinction in mind. So if you specifically search for strategies effective at reducing S-risk, it seems plausible that we will find some even better ones. So to summarize, the question, should you prioritize reducing S-risk, isn't easy, and it hinges on both value judgments and empirical questions. And empirically, the most important questions are how likely are these S-risks, how easy is it to prevent them, and who else is already working on this, how neglected are they? With respect to their probability, I would argue S-risks may be unlikely, but they don't seem much more unlikely than, say, AI-related extinction risk, because they fundamentally depend on the same technological capabilities, and it seems hard to block all the plausible sources through which S-risks could arise given such technological capabilities. And we can also conclude that at first glance, cause areas trying to influence technologies we already worry about with respect to them giving rise to S-risks, that influencing such technologies from the perspective of reducing S-risk is much more important than other work in the X-risk sector, such as biosecurity or asteroid deflection. Second, I would argue that reducing S-risks is at least minimally tractable, because some work in current AI safety and AI strategy is already reducing S-risk. At the same time, my sense is that we don't understand the macro-strategic picture with respect to reducing S-risks very well. So I would hope that with doing more research, we can find even more effective interventions for reducing these risks. Lastly, with respect to their neglectedness, they seem relatively neglected, certainly much more so than efforts addressed at reducing risks of human extinction. This all being said, I don't imagine that I have convinced every single one of you that they should switch maybe from reducing extinction risk to reducing S-risk. I think it's much more likely that in the community we will see a plurality of priorities, with some of us focusing on reducing S-risks, others focusing on reducing extinction risk, and of course still others focusing on completely different cause areas. So I want to end the talk with a vision for the long-term future shaping community and this part of EA. Those of us who care about the long-term future face a long journey, but it's a misrepresentation to frame this journey as a binary choice between extinction or utopia. We do face a long journey, but it's a journey through hard-to-traverse territory. And on the horizon, there is a whole spectrum of possible futures, right? Like a whole spectrum ranging from a hellish thunderstorm to a very beautiful summer day. And those of us who are interested in where we will end up, those who care about the long-term future, we are the ones sort of like locked in this car trying to traverse this territory. And some of us are more worried about avoiding the thunderstorm, others are more moved by the existential hope of getting to this beautiful summer day. We can't quite keep track of all the roads ahead of us, but what we can do is seeing who else is with us in the vehicle, and we can talk to them, compare our maps about the network of roads ahead, and trying to settle our remaining disagreements in such a way that we don't risk derailing the vehicle altogether. Thank you.